we want to start off first by introducing our group, Care for South Pasadena. We are a very new group to the community, so we're always hoping to get new members, grow our members, build coalition and allyship throughout the San Gabriel Valley area, even in the greater Los Angeles area. So who we are a coalition of residents working to reimagine public safety and reallocate city dollars to reflect our community's priorities. We really came together as an informal, really grassroots group of neighbors last year in the summer when we were really impatient and felt the urgency of meeting the moment. We came together in the wake of George Floyd's murder, the call from the Black Lives Matter movement for all of us to be in this fight for racial justice. And of course, there was also the overlay of a global pandemic that's really causing a lot of financial distress to so many people in our community, especially people of color. So what we've come together to do in the past year and hoping to work on in the future is to enhance social services here in South Pasadena and to really rethink public safety by developing effective alternatives to policing. And part of that is to examine the role of policing in South Pasadena and all of the roles that they take in our community functions. One of the really critical ones that we are going to examine tonight is the police's role in providing services to our unhoused neighbors. We want to acknowledge all of the collaborators that we have developed relationships with these past couple of months. That's with Black Lives Matter South Pasadena, the Anti-Racism Committee, and the South Pasadena Tenants Union. We've come together in the past couple of weeks, really over the Thanksgiving and Christmas holiday season, to offer mutual aid to our unhoused neighbors. And from there, our work and coalition has really grown. So we invite you to visit our website at Care for South Pasadena to sign up for our membership list. So you can receive emails from us, and we can email you about any other future mutual aid events that we will have together. To give you an overview of the unhoused, the scope of unhoused people in our city, here is the latest numbers that we have from LAHSA, which does a homeless count every year, except this year because of the pandemic. So in 2020, as a point in time count, one night during the year, we counted as a city 15 unhoused residents. You can see that in 2019, there were almost twice as many people, unhoused people who are counted in the city. And it's because during that year, people in an encampment, as many of you are familiar with, across from the South Pasadena Golf Course, those individuals were included in the count. But in 2020, they weren't. So what's important is that this number is really just an estimate, and it's likely an underestimate, undercount of the actual number of unhoused people in our city, because it's based on one night, based on who the counters can see. And it doesn't always count the people that are technically out of the city's jurisdiction, but still have very much of an impact within our city. So in the next couple of slides, we're going to give you a really brief overview of all the different roles that the police here in South Pasadena play in providing homeless services. One of them is the lost to homeless count. That's a count that produces the numbers that we saw in the previous slide. Many cities do it differently. For example, in the city of LA, from what I understand, it's done mainly by volunteers. But here in the city of South Pasadena, for as far back as we know, the police count our unhoused neighbors. You can see the next couple of bullet points that they also provide their outreach to individuals. There are several different programs that they've come up with in the city and throughout the region of the San Gabriel Valley. So can we move to the next slide? And this slide shows how our city or our city's police department collaborates with different police departments throughout this regional area to provide services to the unhoused. And this is important because you can see that South Pasadena is not unique in the way that it uses the police as a central authority to conduct outreach to unhoused individuals. Our neighboring cities of San Gabriel, San Marino, Alhambra, Monterey Park have a similar structure. Our police department participate in homeless outreach teams with them. And particularly with the city of Arcadia, we have a funded contract to work together to provide services to the homeless, to the unhoused individuals in our cities. I think what's unique about South Pasadena and some of these contracts and arrangements is that our police department serves as a project manager, the project coordinator, and really the source of authority for homeless services. Other cities might have a different dedicated department or a different type of project manager to overseeing these services. But in our city, the police is a central authority and administrative body for providing homeless services. These are just some other examples of the scope of the police's involvement in providing services to the unhoused. We do want to note that there is a collaboration with the Department of Mental Health that provides a rotating clinician to assist patrol officers on a deal with certain encounters involving mental illness. So the partnerships are varied and wide, but again, everything really in our city links back to the South Pasadena Police Department. Something that I think is interesting to note is that the police spend about 10 to 20% of their dispatch call times related to homeless issues. So because they've carved out this role in the city as a central authority for homeless services, people in our community, like myself, like a community member, they do tend to call the police in response to something related to our unhoused neighbors. Another thing that the police have are formal sources and informal sources of authority to police our unhoused neighbors. They often notify unhoused individuals to clear local parks and recreation areas. And they also have an informal role of advising the city on homeless policy and practices. So, for example, as one recent example that we know of, if there's a bench with an unhoused person on it and there are complaints, the police can advise the city to install a divider. So those are more informal sources of authority that the police still very much are influential in, and that I hope that our speakers can help us understand better tonight.
So this slide takes a look at the funding sources that are coming to our city. And you can see there are two different major grants that are meant to fund homeless services. There's the Measure H grant and then the San Gabriel Valley Council of Governments grant. And both dedicate some portion of those funds to sort of case management or project management by the South Pasadena Police Department. So in total, it comes out to about $94,000 going to our police department for these sort of case management or project management services, which, you know, I'll just skip to the next slide. It's not a lot of money, you know, in terms of the overall budget for the South Pasadena Police Department. It's very small. But as a small city with a very, you know, relatively small unhoused population, we don't get a lot of homeless service money. So every dollar counts. And I think, you know, we wanted to put this in here just to sort of emphasize that $94,000, you know, can pay for quite a lot of housing. And there's a sort of growing school of thought in this area that housing ends homelessness, and, you know, where you can spend more dollars on housing and less dollars on other types of administrative costs, you should. So these are just some examples that, you know, we sort of mapped out where you might be able to use some or all of those dollars to put people in hotel rooms through Project Room Key, which, you know, is estimated to be about $2,000 a month, according to Union Station Homeless Services, which is our local service provider. It could be rent if it's subsidized by a Section 8 voucher for 10 households for half the year, or, you know, full rent based on our median rent in South Pasadena for 4 households. So it could go a long way in terms of actually housing people. So with that, I just want to turn it over to our fabulous speakers. Shayla Myers is an attorney and litigator at Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles with an expertise in the criminalization of poverty. And Dr. Robin Petering is a policy and education co-chair at K-Town for All, Koreatown for All, which is a nonprofit organization that's providing a lot of mutual aid and advocacy in the Koreatown area. So I'm gonna, I believe that Shayla is gonna be up first. Do I have that right?
I think so. Shayla here.
Yep, I'm here.
All right, Shayla. I'm going to close out stop sharing my screen and highlight you if I can find you. But jump right in, Shayla.
Great.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
So as Ella and Helen said, my name is Shayla Myers. I'm an attorney with the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles. I actually live not that far away. I'm in Highland Park right now. House in Highland Park, and happy to be talking to all of you. I mentioned to Ella and Helen before I started at the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles about 6 years ago. I actually worked in South Pasadena. I had 2 very fond years working at a small civil rights firm in South Pasadena, and think very highly of the city. So I was really happy to be able to fill in for Gary Blasey, who was a mentor of mine, and I'm always happy to step in for him. Like Ella said, I do focus on the criminalization of homelessness and the criminalization of poverty, because unfortunately, for many, many, many years, many jurisdictions' response to homelessness and poverty has been criminalization, whether that's through the use of passage of laws that disproportionately harm people who are unhoused or who are poor, or through the use of law enforcement to enforce generally applicable laws, but to enforce them more specifically against people who are homeless or poor. So at the Legal Aid Foundation, we're a large organization. We work throughout the city and county of Los Angeles. We provide services on a whole range of issues. My focus, like Ella and Helen said, is on litigation related to the criminalization of homelessness, because unfortunately, what we have seen, not just here in the city of Los Angeles, which tends to be who I sue, unfortunately, but also the county of Los Angeles, statewide, and throughout the United States, the criminalization of homelessness, unfortunately, often leads to the violation of people's constitutional rights. Courts have been very, very clear that the use of law enforcement and the use of laws that disproportionately harm people who are homeless can result in constitutional violations, whether it's laws that limit people's personal property, that results in unhoused people's belongings being thrown away in violation of their 4th and 14th Amendment rights, which are the right to be free from unreasonable seizures, or the right to have due process of law before your property is taken, or laws that prohibit camping in all public spaces. Laws that punish a person for engaging in substantial life activities like sleeping, that we all have to engage in. And when jurisdictions, unfortunately, say you can't camp, you can't sleep in anywhere in the jurisdiction, the courts have ruled that constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. And so, unfortunately, lawyers often get involved when criminalization becomes the main thrust of a city's response to homelessness. So that is my day job, but that's why I'm here to talk about it. I'm going to talk for just a few minutes about criminalization generally. Then I'm going to punt to Robin, who I know well and actually works with K-Town for All, which is a client in one of our cases, which is serendipitous. And then I'm going to, hopefully we'll primarily spend time with questions, because I think what you all want to talk about is more important than what I want to talk about, obviously, because South Pasadena, I know, is the town that you all are committed to. I think you are here on a Tuesday night because you love and are committed to South Pasadena, and you want to talk about the issues that are affecting your community. So I touched a little bit on what we think of criminalization to be. Criminalization is passing laws that punish people for engaging in substantial life activities in public. So sleeping in public, having property in public, really punish people for engaging in activities that they have no choice but to engage in because they are in public, because they're unhoused. That's what we talk about when we mean criminalization. But criminalization isn't just passing laws, right? often jurisdictions will pass laws that criminalize homelessness, that they are rampant around this country. But criminalization can also be telling people to move along out of public spaces that they could otherwise be in because there's a sense that they're unhoused, right? Telling people not to be in parks, telling people not to be in public spaces, telling people not to be sitting on benches because they're unhoused. Treating people differently because they're unhoused in ways that housed folks wouldn't have to deal with law enforcement. So we oftentimes think about criminalization like that. And criminalization, when we think about it, can be incredibly harmful for unhoused people because the use of laws to punish people for engaging in substantial life activities can be incredibly traumatic. It can put people in contact with the criminal justice system that they wouldn't otherwise have contact with. I don't think it's a stretch for most of us to think about getting arrested and getting thrown in jail as being traumatic. But that is what often happens when people are arrested for violating laws that punish them for being out in public. So that's what we mean when we talk about criminalization broadly. But I do want to talk about why I think criminalization has become such an important part of how we think about homelessness, because I think it's an incredibly powerful narrative that has existed in the United States for decades, is the idea that it should or is illegal for a person to be in public when they have no other place to go. Like I said, we see laws that criminalize homelessness all around the country. And I think the reality is when I think about criminalization of homelessness, because it is so rampant, because it happens all around, I want to think about why do we spend so much time, so much energy, and so many resources criminalizing homelessness? Because again, it is so pervasive. And I think one of the reasons why we engage in criminalization of homelessness is because on some level, it is an easier narrative for us to tell ourselves about a person who is unhoused and on the streets. It is an easier thing to say, a person who is unhoused and on the streets, that person is violating the law, than it is to say that we have structural inequality in our city, or in our country, or in our state, or in our county, that justifies why a person can't find a place to live. It's easier to place the blame on a person, and that's what criminalization ultimately does. Criminalization ultimately says that a person who is unhoused is violating the law. And when a person is violating the law, they're doing something wrong, right? They're doing something that they shouldn't be doing. And that gives us the opportunity to be able to point to them as responsible for being unhoused. That has been the common narrative that has been prevailing in the United States, like I said, for decades. I think that narrative is changing. I firmly believe that in many, many, many places around this country, we are starting to understand that the reason why people are living on the sidewalks is because we don't have enough affordable housing, right? Is that in places like California, it is extremely expensive. That in counties like in Los Angeles, we have 550,000 too few affordable units. And that people who are unhoused simply can't afford to survive in Southern California. They can't afford the rent. The rent is too damn high. I firmly believe that we are starting to understand that. We are starting to come to the conclusion that being unhoused is not a person's fault, that they are there because of circumstances. And even if on the micro level, we can point to life decisions that got them to the place that they are unhoused, they're part of structural inequalities that are leading to vast inequalities in our city. But the problem is that has been a long time coming. And we still have vestiges of criminalization that exist even in places where there have been fundamental shifts in the way that we think about homelessness. And one of those vestiges of criminalization is by turning to law enforcement as the primary responder to homelessness. It is if you didn't start from a place of criminalization, it is an incredible mismatch to suggest that law enforcement officers would be the primary service providers in a community to provide services to people who are experiencing homelessness. Because law enforcement officers' jobs are to enforce the law. So in communities that are looking towards homelessness as an issue of criminalization, leading with law enforcement makes sense. But as jurisdictions have moved away from that and towards different understandings of homelessness, unfortunately, those are the communities where we still tend to look to the police as the primary outreach workers. And the reality is law enforcement officers, from my perspective, can never serve the role as outreach workers. And the reason for that is that there's a fundamental mismatch between what law enforcement officers do at their core, which is enforce the law, and what outreach workers do, which is, and I know Robin is going to talk about outreach because she's going to talk about KFA's model and other work. So I will defer to her about what outreach workers do. But the reality is that oftentimes outreach is inconsistent with the role of law enforcement. And I think the reality is that's not just on the macro level. The reality is it's true on a micro level too, because so many folks in our community have had negative interactions with law enforcement. And we don't have to say that it's anyone's fault or responsibility. I think we could have different conversations about that, but we don't have to have them here. All we can acknowledge, and I think we can all acknowledge this, I certainly think this group is coming to a place of acknowledging that, of saying that sometimes people's experiences with law enforcement has been traumatic. And I think the reality is oftentimes lots of our experiences with law enforcement are traumatic, having nothing to do with law enforcement, but having to do with the state power that comes with enforcing laws. It can be traumatic. And so when people have trauma related to law enforcement, that's not the place for forming the types of connections that we expect outreach workers to form. So even if on an individual level, law enforcement officers are great at doing the work of the community, they're doing the work of law enforcement officers. And that's just a fundamentally different role than outreach workers are providing. But again, because we've come from a place of understanding for decades that homelessness was a criminal issue, so often we have these vestiges of using law enforcement for purposes of outreach. And I think the goal should be to think about homelessness in a different kind of way when we think about the services that we're providing to folks. One of the things that I think when we do this work that we primarily think about is when we think about people who are unhoused, is a narrative that we tell often, that unhoused folks are service resistant. I hear that narrative nearly everywhere I go, is that a person who is offered services and doesn't need or want the services that are being provided to them is service resistant. And sometimes we tell the story that when we come across someone who is service resistant, we need to use the force of law. We need to use law enforcement officers, or we need to use punishment to get people to accept those services. And I think that understanding of how people exist in the world also goes back to this idea that it's much easier to think that a person isn't accepting the services than it is for us to have to engage in whether or not the services that we're providing to a person are the services that they need to move off the streets. And it makes it easier for us to not have those really deep, really hard conversations about the fact that the only thing that can ultimately solve homelessness is housing. I'm going to turn it over to Robin because I know she's going to talk about outreach, and then I'll be back to answer questions. And I'm going to turn my video off because we unfortunately are a 2 Zoom call household right now, and I want to preserve a little bit of bandwidth for my partner who's also on a Zoom call.
Awesome. Wow. It's really hard to follow Shayla. Honestly, I also learned so much listening to Shayla, and it's just fantastic. So I'll try to add more to this narrative, and yeah, I'm really excited to get into questions folks have and get into more of a dialogue. But I'll start with the background of myself. I am a social worker. I started actually doing street outreach when I was really right out of college. And so I worked, I was in Eugene, Oregon, and I would pass out socks and granola bars and other things like that to young people on the streets in Oregon. And our goal was also to build relationships with folks to make them aware of the services that were available at the outreach center that I was working at. That's kind of like the root of where a lot of my work has come from. But after doing that work for so long, it didn't take me long actually to come to the realization of doing outreach and all of that I'm in working directly with people that were experiencing homelessness. Some of the fundamental flaws that existed in our system, our overall service system, and the challenges and barriers it is for an individual to go through that. And in kind of what Shayla was talking about, that realization that the experience of homelessness and houselessness is not it became very clear to me very early through that work that it's not an individual, it's not the result of individual actions, but more of a larger political structural like gap of things, right? And so that was a motivation for myself to get deeper into this work and look at like how could I be a part of something that could potentially help change that cycle, right? Addressing like you can't, like working with the individual level was really difficult for me. So I moved to Los Angeles and became a social worker, got embedded in and connected with agencies and organizations across the city. I've been here now for 10 years. I got my PhD in social work as well, and I'm a researcher now currently, and I've studied and looked into things about the experiences of homelessness, including the experiences of violence and trauma on the streets. But now currently my day-to-day is really looking at solutions, right? Really getting into like, what are the solutions? How can we make services better? How can we make the system better? How can we address this crisis that we're experiencing currently on a larger level and all work together in better ways. So that's what I do day to day at my organization. And then I also serve as a policy co-chair at K-Town for All. So that also brought me to, once I got deeper into some of the research work and looking at programs and housing programs, there became another question that one of the big actors in the crisis overall in Los Angeles, in the city of Los Angeles and the county are even at a higher level in the like the policy level. And that's some things that we do at K-Town for All. So K-Town for All is both a mutual aid organization. We do direct outreach and services to our neighbors by some of the things that you all are doing in your community. Again, like passing out things like socks, tents, tarps, making relationships with our neighbors in K-Town. But then we also realize that mutual aid is only one part of this, what we can do, and what we really need to be doing is focusing energy on addressing kind of those systemic, broader issues of the way that our system has been designed to intervene with homelessness and kind of redirect it into a way that doesn't have to violate human rights, that is less traumatic, is also effective, right? And in thinking about long-term solutions. So K-Town for All also engages on policy and advocacy. The work, Shayla and I work together on a coalition called Services Not Sweeps. And we've been working on a platform of really highlighting the importance of services and coming from a public health perspective, a person-centered perspective, and evidence-based perspective over things like criminalization. And Shayla gave a really good background on the history of criminalization. I'll say, some of the stuff like when we're talking about the use of tools like criminalization, like law enforcement as outreach workers, I think one of the things that I like to think about a lot is the effectiveness of those tools, like how we put in resources to places and where we're putting our resources to places and how effective that is, right? So we know effective solutions for addressing homelessness are housing, but the building systems that work for people, that meet people where they're at. That includes building long-term relationships. That includes coming into communities, understanding structural traumas, individual traumas, and and navigating and helping folks come into spaces that are like respective or kind of address or understand that, right? And one of the things when there's criminalization or enforcement attached to it, attached to services, uh, it's often I work with young people, right? I work with youth, and it's not an effective solution often because just by nature, criminalization can often keep you can be actually a barrier for exiting homelessness, right? So those are one of the things that I just sometimes I'm like, it doesn't make any sense, right? To me, sometimes that we put resources into if you get a ticket, right? That goes onto your record. That costs money to address, right? It's this perpetuating cycle of poverty. You might have interaction with law enforcement, and that could lead to losing services, to losing a job. You might have interaction with other types of enforcement based services, and you might lose important documents that are important for getting into housing and other types of resources. So there are even like fundamental things built into services or into services that include enforcement that actually, might make a person's experience on the street longer rather than uh, what we all want is helping people exit out of homelessness and move into stability, right? So that's some often like, just thinking on kind of a fundamental issue of like where are we putting our resources, and are we being smart and effective with the way that we are coming towards this crisis, right? In both our time and our energy and our funding. We talked about I saw the bar graph or the pie charts earlier, right? And a lot of the conversations that we're having in Los Angeles and other communities is about reallocating those resources. Can we spend our municipal money, our time, our energy in ways that would be more effective? And that's why we're advocating at K-Town for All to shift those into outreach services with homelessness service providers, with people that have expertise in this area, that have an outreach worker can connect you to navigate to basic services, places where you can get food, places where you can get a shower, right? But then the next step, places where you can get into interim short-term housing to long-term housing, and build those long relationships that are built on trust and rapport and things that are so often for someone that's experienced a long that might have been on the streets for a long period of time, those things have been missing, right? And they've had a lot of experiences with systems that their trust has been broken, and how that comes into play in the way the path towards exiting homelessness, how important it is, trust and rapport and relationship building. So those are the things that we advocate for always. I've been talking also a lot about thinking through, this path to stability. I talk about, not that exiting homelessness is not only housing, it's this sense of stability. And someone asked me the other day, what does that mean? And I think that's being able to meet your basic resources, basic needs, having a roof over your head, but also that sense of safety, right? How important just a sense of safety is in the overall concept of stability. Like I feel safe in my home right now. I feel safe often when I step outside my home and am walking through my neighborhood. And how, you know, we can be continuing to build this sense of stability and safety for everyone in our city, right? Both in just creating safe spaces around our community that may not have to be, you know, it doesn't always have to be. Permanent supportive housing is the ultimate goal, but we can continue to build safety and stability in our neighbors' lives through different aspects, right? And so I think that's one thing that we should start thinking through: how can we provide that and show up to our neighbors in different ways? We just did a recent, I do research, right? We just did a recent study of young people in Venice, and we asked them, do you ever avoid neighborhoods because there's law enforcement there? And 70% said yes, they do. On more often than not, that they're going around through their neighborhood and they're avoiding specific places because they don't want to have interaction with that could potentially, you know, result in something that could be traumatic for them. So I think that was really telling to me, and how and Shayla kind of mentioned that earlier, how just that sense of safety for people that are unhoused or appear homeless or unhoused, you know, that's taken away from them in so many places. And that's really like a privilege that a lot of us carry around with us every day, that we can go into spaces, we can go into Starbucks and not be harassed or asked to leave. There are places that exist, or there's so few places that exist for the unhoused community that provide that sense of reprieve and safety, right? Most of the time during the day is spent, you know, at risk for other things, of being criminalized, of being harassed, or being asked to move around. And most of us do not experience that. And I just think about like how, you know, how that's just such a basic human need that so many of us don't have, or so many people in our communities don't have, and we should really be advocating for all the time. Um, I, I think I'd love to just like get to questions, and I don't.
Let's do it. Yeah, I have a question actually from somebody who wants to remain anonymous. So this is for either Shayla or Robin. Can either of you speak to the guarding of Caltrans homes in South Pasadena, El Sereno, Pasadena, that prevent unhoused people from seeking shelter there?
Shayla.
I mean, I what I know about it, I know from folks sort of in the movement who have been doing this work, the Reclaiming Our Homes movement, and the history of the Caltrans properties. So I'm not sure what specifically to talk about, but so I'll wax philosophical for 20 seconds about that particular issue, because I think it's really, really important about people taking back the properties that exist in the community by saying that enough is enough. We have a desperate housing situation and people are living on the streets, and these are properties that are available. I think the reality is CHP has come in and taken a very forceful presence to keep people out of those homes. That is probably the most extreme example that we can think of about the criminalization of taking back spaces that people are going into because there is no space for people to live. These are people who absolutely want a place to live, and there isn't a place for them to go. I mean, I think it's a complicated issue about the use of law enforcement related to trespassing, but it is a visceral example in our community of law enforcement standing guard outside of homes and keeping people out. And it's I think it's one of the more stark images that I think that we will have about this time in our community and in our society about homelessness.
We got another question from Lori. She writes, while I agree with the end goal of decriminalizing the unhoused, what type of infrastructure needs to be in place before making that shift? Do we have the trained outreach services and medical staff to replace the role of the police?
I mean, the answer is there are trained outreach workers and services and medical staff, but not at the scale that we need at all, right? So I think there's a lot of conversations in Los Angeles of also, a lot of what often police are coming to respond to, or maybe getting called for addressing someone that's unhoused, are mental health crises, right? And we don't have, I think like the Department of Mental Health has like 2 mobile crisis vans for the whole county, or it's very limited. Um, and there's talks of unarmed mobile crisis units, 24 hours. That I came from Eugene, Oregon. There's a program called Cahoots there, and that's often a tool that we used in Eugene, two crisis responders. One was often trained in mental health crisis response. The other was a basic paramedic, and could respond to basic like medical care on call 24 hours, right? And it's very useful in that community, and that's something that I think we could scale up. It's just that we haven't been investing in services like that enough. But also, decriminalizing the infrastructure. I mean, I feel like, Shayla, we're often fighting the city of just everything doesn't have to be a crime also, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that that is a critical piece of decriminalization is not just getting to a place where there's someone to replace law enforcement to do the work of outreach, because that's important, right? Outreach is important, but it's also getting to a place where we don't need law enforcement to enforce laws that are there for the purposes of making it a crime to be unhoused on the sidewalks. We know that again, like I said in my presentation, like that those kinds of interactions can be incredibly traumatic, and they also can be incredibly costly for communities, and they can keep people from moving forward and moving out of homelessness when housing is available to them. So part of decriminalization is both replacing, but it's also just getting to a place where we understand that we don't need those kinds of interactions, that they're not about the needs of folks who are unhoused. They're about something different. And moving away from that, needing that something different is important.
John, did you want to ask your question?
Yes, please. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, Shayla. Hi, Robin. Thank you so much for coming. I want to mention an unfortunate situation we had, I believe, back in 2017. We have a resident who essentially, he got his own personal ordinance passed through city council. He was having trouble because a neighbor's property was being used by a homeless person to seek shelter. And we fought it and we lost, and he got 2 sections added to the municipal code under the public nuisance chapter. And I want to read just a little bit of these. Number 26, these qualify as a public nuisance. The use or occupation of a cargo container, travel trailer, camper, motorhome, vehicle, or recreational vehicle as a temporary or permanent residence while parked on private or public property. And 27, the use of camping equipment and facilities for habitation or other residential uses, unless such activities are expressly authorized pursuant to SPMC 21.10. This section is not intended to prohibit overnight camping on private residential property by friends or family of the property owner. Do these sections get around the constitutional concerns that you mentioned earlier?
I'm assuming that's a question for the lawyer on the panel. I mean, I think anytime a jurisdiction has an anti-camping provision, there's going to be questions about whether or not it prohibits people from sleeping on the sidewalk. It prohibits people from engaging in substantial life activities to the extent that it constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. I mean, without knowing the details around how the statute is enforced, I couldn't tell you. And I definitely can't give legal advice on a recorded panel. It's a terrible idea. You don't want me to do it, and the state bar doesn't want me to do it either. But what I will say more broadly is whether or not something passes constitutional muster, first of all, I love our Constitution. Cheers, great thing. it's a super low bar, guys. It's a super low bar for a jurisdiction to say that they are simply not engaging in something that constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. And I think like that's literally the least a jurisdiction can do. And I think that the reality is when ordinances like that exist on the books, what they're doing is they're not acknowledging the economic realities that exist in California. They're not acknowledging the economic realities that exist in Los Angeles County, and they're not doing their part for the city of Pasadena or South Pasadena to address that crisis on a regional level, because they're saying that you can't come up with ways to survive in the city through the use of zoning. So I don't even think we have to get to the constitutional analysis to say that those kinds of ordinances are really harmful for what they do. Some other day I'll sit down and read your ordinances and maybe write a memo about it.
Matthew, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, please. Hi. Earlier, you mentioned that you hear a common refrain in communities that homeless populations refuse services or deny services, and that's not particularly accurate. That most of them want services. Can you describe some of the barriers that unhoused people face when they're offered services, like being offered housing but without allowing to bring your things or your pets, or very limited, or maybe it's for a short amount of time, and when they come back, their unhoused camp might be robbed or destroyed, and so they have to stick around and protect it. What are some of the other things that they face?
You go, Robin.
I mean, yeah, those were great examples, right? So often people are being offered maybe a service, right? Not a choice of services. I think there's a lot about autonomy and being able to allow people the options to decide what they want to do, or what would be the best choice for them, right? And often when we hear people using the narrative of service resistant, they're not given choice, right? It's, here's a shelter bed, and they're like, I don't want a shelter bed. Oh, they're service resistant, right? Or I can't take a shelter bed because I have a dog, or I have a partner, or there's a COVID crisis, happening, and I don't want to be in a shelter bed, which is a great reason. We often talk about too, I was just reading this paper that a friend of mine wrote, and that they were talking about kind of like the opportunity cost, right? So how much am I going to have to put in to, like, what do I have to go through all these hoops. I have to do a lot of things for an option that may be short-term, right? Or again, might not be exactly what I want. I think that's a really important thing. Or you're a person that's been in a system for a really long time. You've worked with a case manager or a foster care case manager forever, and you've been screwed over, I guess, maybe is like the simplest way to put it. So why would I trust you to give that? You're offering me this thing that you say is going to help me, but that's what everyone said before. Those are some reasons. So Shayla, do you have more to add about the service resistant?
I mean, just that I think to your point, the reality is that oftentimes we look at the people who are not taking the services rather than asking questions about why they're not. We look to the people to blame them. I think that's the issue of service resistance, right? This idea that I have the thing that you need, why don't you want it? And I think the reality is that that's a way to think about services that is focused on the people who are providing it and the systems that are providing it, as opposed to having real and important conversations with unhoused folks about why the services that are being offered don't match. I will say that it's services, not sweeps. We think of services very broadly, because the reality is I have yet to meet an unhoused person, particularly in Los Angeles, but in other places, that doesn't want a bathroom, right? That doesn't want routine trash pickups, that doesn't want hand sanitizing stations and ways to charge their phone, and those kinds of things. Those are the types of services we ask unhoused folks, what do you need? That's what we hear in terms of services. That's a broad way to think about services, and we never come across folks who are who are resistant to those kinds of services. It's really about thinking about what do unhoused folks need, and thinking about systems delivery from that standpoint, and not thinking about this within the context of blame, right? About building the systems or not taking them or those kinds of things.
That's a great point.
Great.
Sorry.
I love it. So we got a question from Sally. Where did the funds for Cahoots come from? And Robin, you put in the chat, I think it's funded through the police department. Do you have more to expound on that? Because I do want to note, we're trying, Care First South Pasadena is trying to bring you a program on Cahoots. Stay tuned.
Yeah, the
date.
Cahoots people are fantastic. I do believe that they redirected some of the funding from the police department, but Cahoots at this point in Eugene is 30 years old. So get Ben Adam Clymer on a call and he will tell you all about it, and it's really fantastic.
We're trying. All right, this question
I believe he's in Pasadena too.
Yeah, I think he's our guy. This question's from Sonia to Shayla. Can you give us the names of some current or past cases that raise Martin versus City of Boise constitutional violations, so we can review some of the filings?
Well, I mean, I know we talk about Martin because Martin is the case that's sort of like the big one, but in general, what they are is Eighth Amendment cases, right, that focus on cruel and unusual punishment. The city of Los Angeles was one of the earliest cases to bring a challenge based on the Eighth Amendment, and it's Jones versus City of Los Angeles. That was brought in 2006, but it's really, really relevant because it really laid the framework for Martin, and it laid the framework in Southern California in the systems that we have. There have been other smaller jurisdictions that have brought Martin challenges. In general, cities, in our experience, cities are aware of Martin versus City of Boise. They're now aware of the Eighth Amendment. Again, the Eighth Amendment has been there since 1789, but same Eighth Amendment, same bar, but we're just much more aware of it. And so luckily, lots and lots of jurisdictions have responded to Martin without the need for litigation. Sometimes Martin challenges can be complicated, they're really factual. And luckily, we've just had the experience that most jurisdictions have done the right thing around anti-camping.
Shayla, can I jump in and just ask you to explain for folks who don't know what Martin versus City of Boise sort of stands for, and what that means, like complying with Martin or not?
Sure. So in Martin versus City of Boise took place in Boise, Idaho, obviously, which had an ordinance, and this case went on for like a decade and a half, but they had an ordinance that banned camping in public and sleeping in public all over the city, with no exceptions. And so a person couldn't physically live in Boise if they were unhoused, and engage in life activities without violating the law. Literally, a person couldn't sleep in Boise if they were unhoused without violating the law. And the Ninth Circuit, following up on Jones, said it's cruel and unusual punishment to punish someone for engaging in a life activity on the street when they have no other option. What was really significant about Martin, though, is that no other option was really, really compassionately and empathetically defined to take into account some of those things that the person who asked about shelter resistance mentioned, right? About they said that if a shelter wasn't accessible because of disability, or if shelter wasn't accessible because of religious affiliation, then a person couldn't be compelled to go into that shelter. That shelter wasn't available for them, and so they didn't have the opportunity to sleep on the sidewalk, or to not be arrested for sleeping on the sidewalk. So Martin really just stands for the proposition that you can't punish people for being homeless and engaging in life activities for being outside. And so when jurisdictions have had anti-camping ordinances that are broad enough to prohibit camping and sleeping on the sidewalk in a jurisdiction, those don't pass constitutional muster sort of when you look at them, if people are being prosecuted for them. And so lots and lots of jurisdictions. Modesto is a really good example of a jurisdiction that had an anti-camping ordinance and did the right thing. What they did was they basically said, well, okay, we get it, Ninth Circuit, we understand cruel and unusual punishment is bad standard. We're going to allow people, we're going to set up a camp for folks, and we're going to let people camp in the parks and open up the parks and made them accessible. Other jurisdictions have done that too. It's like the Ninth Circuit's big and vast and includes all of California and Oregon, Washington, Idaho, obviously. So it's been a little bit of a game changer for folks.
So question from Bill, in the absence of enough housing now or in the near future, what would an ideal city provided set of services to homeless residents include? For instance, some have emphasized the need for secure storage. Like what's sort of the set of services you think a city can provide if they don't have a lot of affordable housing to offer at this time?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of things that, Shayla discussed earlier, services being simple things, right? So being able to meet your basic, basic needs and resources of bathrooms, showers. But I think, we've seen a lot of success in communities where people start outreach groups that go and meet people where they're at and provide those like resources that might be necessary, like simple socks, and connect people back to places where they can take a shower safely. And, I mean, meal services. I think like there are a lot of services that, we don't always think about, like laundry access. I'm trying to think through some other things. But I mean, even just what Shayla said, just opening up safe places for people to camp or take. I keep going back to this idea of this like places where people can feel safe or build a sense of safety or find moments of safety, I think are really important. So access centers are some things that we've seen be really important touchstones for folks here, like a simple drop-in center where a person can come for a couple hours, get a meal, sit safely, and then when they're ready, potentially connect with a case manager or a housing navigator or a lawyer or medical services. I think those are really important parts of the service spectrum, even when there's not enough housing available.
And I would say to a group like this, because I love this group, what I would say is one of the things that I love most about Keytown for All is the outreach model that they have that engages with their neighbors. That's really about getting to know your unhoused neighbors. And I think the answer to the question of what services do people need is best answered by the people who need them.
Yeah.
And I think you have the luxury of having a small homeless population that you can engage with and ask those questions in really, really robust and meaningful ways. When Services Not Sweeps put together its platform, we put together the platform after engaging with unhoused folks around the city for a long time to have conversations about what was working and what wasn't, what was needed. Some of the things that we had never thought of when we sat around thinking about what do people need have become the single most important things for our platform. And the last thing that I would just say on that point is that starting to think about it, like what do people need and how do we support our neighbors is a way to break down the incredible like disengagement and sort of bifurcation that's happening in our community all over, which is this idea that there's something different between a person who is housed and a person who is unhoused, right? There is. It's access to safe and healthy housing. That's the fundamental difference. And if criminalization drives that divide home, right? Because it says one group is a criminal and the other group is criminalizing them. But when we engage on these issues and we talk to our unhoused neighbors and we start to think about what do we as a community need to do to support each other, then like we can really, not to like get into this, like, I feel like very like at the end of the day, like I'm singing for some like kumbaya moment, but like really breaking down that division between housed and unhoused and starting to think about what do we need as a community to support each other will go a very long way. The County of Los Angeles would be in a much better position if we could just start thinking about what do our most vulnerable members need as opposed to like homeless and unhoused and housed. And take down hostile architecture, take down the bars that exist on benches, just take them out, just take them out.
I want to be respectful of your time. We have a few more questions. Can you guys stay for a little bit longer?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure, that was my like sponsor. I got nothing else to add other than like, sure.
I love it. Okay. John, I'm going to just turn it back to you to ask the question that you put in the chat.
Okay, sure. I guess this is more to our two council members in attendance. Would it be possible to explore an analysis of SPMC 24.02, C26 and 27? Those are the subsections I read earlier. An analysis of those subsections in terms of the Martin v. Boise case that was discussed a few minutes ago. I guess that's just a request to possibly put that on the pre-agenda agenda.
We can put that in a motion as one of the council members' comments, and somebody has to second. Maybe Jack can second, and it will be put in the agenda. However, there's going to be the involvement of our city attorney, and we have to determine what are the penalties. And I'm surprised that they made it to the code without any challenges. I'm not familiar, Jan, with your procedure, why you lost, because these are serious constitutional violations. It's discrimination, to put it in a basic language. So I would be willing to put this, make a motion to put it in the agenda for our February 17 meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, this question is from Christine. She writes, I noticed that a bench close by my house recently had a bar installed to prevent a really kind homeless man from sleeping there. Who was responsible for that installation? I assume it served its purpose as he no longer is in my neighborhood. I think I know which bench you're talking about. But, Robin and Shayla, do you want to speak to just generally how those kinds of structural kind of hostile architecture changes happen?
I mean, I don't know how sometimes people do them just on their own, because we've been seeing that a lot more in Los Angeles, but yeah, it goes to Public Works. I don't know. Shayla.
I think the reality is, at least in most places, people ask for them, and then jurisdictions respond. I think for a very, very long time, cities have looked to that kind of hostile architecture as a way to force people to move along, as a way to make homelessness invisible, as a way to say this person is bothering me and giving me a sense that my community is, some people say unsafe, I would say full of structural inequality, but I don't want to see it, and so put up a bar. That's why I say remove them all. Because I think the reality is they not only push people away, they force people to move along, but they also dehumanize people. They say to people who have no other place to sleep than on a bench, you can't sleep here. This is not for you. This public space is not for you to use the public space the way that you need to. That kind of dehumanizing message is the kind of trauma that we talk about. It is the kind of thing that makes it harder to survive. And there's nothing like a message that says my community doesn't want me here, that reinforces that divide that I was talking about, that us versus them divide.
Okay, we got a question about putting together a list of organizations that we can get involved with to volunteer, and I'm just gonna say that we will do that, and we will share it with folks who have attended. We're so excited that you asked. Andrew asked, what can be done specifically to help the unhoused? Would it help if we made it easier for the unhoused to vote?
Yeah, I think we K-Town for All released we have like a voting white page, or I released a research paper recently about unhoused voting engagement, and LA County has done a lot to reduce barriers for access or for registering to vote. You don't need an address to register to vote. You didn't have to, voting center, but I guess that like doesn't really matter as much anymore. But I think we want to continue to get folks politically engaged on different levels, bringing unhoused community into like what are political spaces or at different levels, right? So there's talks about bringing lived experience, bringing the voices of unhoused in LA City Council right now, but I think that even trickles down to kind of what Shayla was talking about, being able to engage folks in conversations in the way you design programs, the way you design services, hiring people for that input, and really valuing it in a way, and like putting it to like actually making it real, right? So taking folks' input and actually turning it into something is also like a very important part of it. I think like on the question, what has been done politically to help the unhoused, I think one of the things that, that's really important is changing the narrative, educating all the time, just having panels like this where we're bringing in the perspective that the experience of being unhoused and homelessness is a structural inequalities. It goes back to these things like our long-term history of criminalization, and so continuing to like just really reinforcing that narrative and build back on these misconceptions and stereotypes have been like deeply embedded in our communities for so long. So I think that's a really important part of to help the unhoused community politically.
And I would just say having conversations like this that ground the issues related to homelessness in a political narrative, in a political conversation, and also understands this issue of criminalization of homelessness within the larger context of racial justice, within the larger fights against white supremacy, within the bigger structural inequalities that exist, and understand that this is a part of it is really important. Like I was really excited to engage in this conversation because of the group that was engaging in it, right? That it's not just thinking about homelessness as, as a poverty issue, but thinking about it as a structural issue. Also, not the worst strategy to get your council members on a Zoom call and then ask them to agendize an issue. I mean, cheers. And then, find ways for unhoused people to be able to participate in that process.
I think that Matthew, you get the last comment of the night.
Thank you. This is a comment, and maybe you can elaborate on it, but since I've become more engaged in this topic and been out meeting people and sort of studying it more myself, one of the things that I've been astounded by is how much resources, time, energy, money has gone into denying people things, instead of that same money could be put into providing people with opportunities, with housing, with different things, and that would alleviate their problem and the community's problem. Whereas right now we're trying to alleviate the community's problems by putting in bars, and goes all the way back. The Caltrans. I can't imagine how much money Caltrans spent guarding their houses over the holidays with overtime. It's got to be in the millions of dollars. And if they had handed out vouchers and given people hotels or rooms, then they wouldn't have to guard the houses, because those people wouldn't need a place to stay. And so we're putting on money and spending a lot of it on things that we don't need to. And it has the veneer of helping our community, but it doesn't, because we still have these people that need help. They're still here. And even if we push them behind a building, they're still here. Push them into the next town, they're still here. So we have to really come up with solutions that will solve the problem for them and for us. And I guess that's my comment. And if there anything that you guys wanted to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just that they're still here, right? It's that they're part of our community, and that the homeless population is never a stagnant population, right? The reality is in Southern California, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of millions of people on the verge of experiencing homelessness, right? They are our community. We are their community. We are, you are South Pasadena, and they are part of that. And I think, to that, it's not just about saying like it is about understanding that this is a community issue, because as a community you care for these kinds of issues, and thinking about it like that is a cheaper way to address it. On the Caltrans, it's not just the cost of like the cops that they could have like put people in vouchers. They legit could have just done like mold remediation and like gotten people into those houses. Yeah. Right. Like if we thought about it as let's solve the problem instead of let's to your point, let's keep the space, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, also to kind of go off what Shayla was saying, I mean, I think we often try to, or I often try to reframe in conversations that homelessness obviously isn't an identity, it's an experience, right? And that experience, it's not a binary, it's not housed, you're not just go housed, unhoused all the time. So there's such a range, and people can flex back and forth. And it's just like thinking about in a different concept of just like this person versus that person, right? And how that we're often in that narrative. Yeah, and homelessness is really expensive, but in ending it is actually very cost saving, and like intervening early is better, right? We don't talk enough about like protecting rents and evictions and how that is much cheaper than allowing that every day that someone spends on the streets we're accruing costs, and that just builds and builds and builds. So yeah, we're all better off by addressing these problems in different ways.
Okay, well, this has been fabulous. Thank you so much, Robin and Shayla. You guys are amazing, very enlightening, and thank you everyone for attending. We will circulate some of the resources and issues that came up during the call. We'll send them out to this group so everybody has them, and we look forward to continuing to talk and meet about these issues.